Hey, welcome to the most exciting web series on the internet. Today we're going to discuss Chapter 4 of Golding's Lord of the Flies. The chapter is entitled Painted Faces and Long Hair. The painted faces part we'll get to in a second. The long hair is starting to refer to the sheer length of time that the boys have been spending on the island, um, which is what the first part of the chapter covers, is that makes the claim that the boys are sort of becoming accustomed to life on the island. That on one hand, at the beginning of the chapter, it says, it was a time when play was good and life so full that hope was not necessary and therefore forgotten. But strangely, the word is strange, the second paragraph, strange things happen at midday. So while they're growing accustomed to the island, that also means growing accustomed to the strange things that are happening in and around the island. So strange things happened at midday. The glittering sea rose up, moved apart in plains of blatant impossibility. The coral reef and the few stunted palms that clung to the more elevated parts would float up into the sky, would be quiver, be plucked apart, run like raindrops on a wire, or repeated as in an old succession of mirrors. Sometimes land loomed where there was no land and flicked out like a bubble as the children watched. Piggy discounted all of this learnedly as a mirage, and Snowboy could even reach the reef over the stretch of water where the snapping sharks waited. They grew accustomed to these mysterious and ignored them, just as they ignored the miraculous throbbing stars. At midday, the illusions merged into the sky, and the sun gazed down like an angry eye. There's your simile, like an angry eye. Hopefully, you've been annotating those. One thing that has sort of helped that acclimation process is the tradition of work. Page 59, the boys on the island have become sort of industrious, especially the little ones. They have made play almost a job. The hunters are still the hunters, and the only one that doesn't ever really seem to work is Piggy, and also Ralph, I should say. So yeah, we see that the Littluns, that everyone seems to be sort of acclimating to even the stranger parts of the island. Telling Lon on page 59, it says they cried for their mothers much less often than might have been expected. So interesting. Then we shift and we start becoming more. We get more exposure to the Littluns, specifically this little kid Henry, who is the biggest of them. Who, strangely enough, or maybe not strangely, is the relative of the boy who had the mark on his face. They talk about how he's playing with two younger boys, Percival and Johnny, and hunters come through the woods and smash their castle, and Henry runs off, and one of the hunters, Roger, follows him and is watching Henry play, and it's a really kind of odd thing that Henry becomes preoccupied with. So he runs down the beach and he thinks he's alone, and Henry runs down the beach. He believes he's alone. He's playing in the tide, the waves that are rolling up, and Roger follows him. It says on page 61. Henry walked at a distance from the palms in the shade because he was too young to keep himself out of the sun. He went down the beach and busied himself at the water's edge. The great Pacific tide was coming in, and every few seconds the relatively still water of the lagoon heaved forward an inch. There were creatures that lived in this last fling of the sea, tiny transparencies that came questing in with the water over the hot, dry sand. Maybe you've been to the beach, you've noticed that when the tide comes in, that it brings with it creatures, little organisms, and he's really intently watching the interplay of these tiny organisms. There were creatures that lived in this last fling of the sea, tiny transparencies that came questing in with the water over the hot, dry sand. With impalpable organs of sense, they examined this new field. Perhaps food had appeared, where at last the incursion there had been none. Bird droppings, insects, perhaps any of the strewn detritus of landward life. Like a myriad of tiny teeth in a saw, the transparencies came scavenging over the beach. So it's interesting that Henry is really into watching the scene, and of course the organisms that are scavenging for food don't know that they're being watched because how could they? They're single-mindedly trying to find food and just exist in this hostile environment, which is really telling. So page 61, I hope you got that this idea that, are the boys like the organisms that are being feasted upon? Is there something intently watching them that they are unaware of? Are the Littluns, and even including the hunters and Ralph and Piggy, are they those little scurrying things that the tide has brought in that are being hunted or stalked and observed unbeknownst to them? This was fascinating to Henry. He poked about with a bit of stick that itself was wave-worn and whitened and vagrant. He tried to control the motions of the scavengers. He made little runnels that the tide filled and tried to crowd them with creatures. He became absorbed beyond mere happiness as he felt himself exercising control over living things. Exercising control over living things. Very important. It's almost like a god complex, like he's trying to alter the existence of both of these organisms. Driven by the tide, his footprints became bays in which they were trapped and gave him the illusion of mastery. He squatted on his hands at the water's edge, bowed, and with a shock of hair falling over his forehead and past his eyes, an afternoon sun emptied down invisible arrows. Very interesting. Soon Roger, just to mess with him, starts throwing rocks at him, but something holds him back from actually throwing them in order to hit Henry. Perhaps it's this vestige, this attachment to civility that he has come from, that he remembers a time when throwing rocks at little kids was bad. So something inside him, he's okay with throwing them in general direction, but he's intentionally missing Henry with the rocks. Next, we have the hunters parade out of the woods. This is top of page 63, but they are different, right? And remember when I told you, I've told you several times about this idea of things going in and out of the woods, of darkness, of creatures that exist in two worlds. Well, the hunters are precisely that. Here, Sam and Eric were waiting, and Bill, Jack, concealed from the sun, knelt by the pool and opened the two large leaves that he carried. So think giant leaves. One of them contained white clay and the other red. By them lay a stick of charcoal brought down from the fire. Jack explained to Roger as he worked. They don't smell me, they see me, I think. Something pink under the trees. He smeared on the clay. Here we get to the painted faces part of the title. If only I'd some green. He turned a half-concealed face up to Roger and answered the incomprehension of his gaze. For hunting, like in the war, dazzle paint, like things trying to look like something else. He twisted in the urgency of telling, like moths on a tree trunk. Bottom of page 63. He is frustrated that he can't get the mask on right, and he finally gets clay on his face in a way that he likes. He says he knelt holding the shell of water. A rounded patch of sunlight fell on his face, and a brightness appeared in the depths of the water. He looked in astonishment, no longer at himself, but at an awesome stranger. He spit the water and leapt to his feet, laughing excitedly. Beside the pool, a sinewy body held up a mask that drew their eyes and appalled them. He began to dance, and his laughter became a bloodthirsty snarling. So putting on this mask has almost immediately changed him, where now Jack is prancing around in this crazy dancing and screaming a bloodthirsty snarl. And he beckons the other boys to come with him into the woods, and they kind of resist. But the last piece of that section on page 64, the last line, the mask compelled them. So this symbolism of the mask as a way of control. Where else have we seen symbols of control in this text? Think back to the conch shell that Ralph uses to summon all the boys on the island. That the mask has its own power, especially over the hunters. On the beach, Piggy and Ralph and Simon are hanging out on the beach, not working, and they notice far off in the distance in the horizon some perhaps smoke on the horizon of perhaps a distant ship. And to their surprise and horror, when they go to check on the fire that the hunters are supposed to be keeping, Jack's hunters, they find that the fire is out. That is no longer smoke coming from the island. So that signal smoke that should have, or perhaps would have, demonstrated to that distant ship that there's somebody on the island is put out. Well, we just saw the hunters. What are they doing? They're perfecting more of their facial painting, and they're more far concerned with the hunt itself. So this sort of really interesting scene happens near the end of the chapter, starting on page 68. That you have Ralph, Piggy, and Simon angry at the fire that has been put out, and all of a sudden this procession, the hunters come out of the woods. The procession had appeared. Procession means like a parade. Far down the pink stones that lay near the water's edge, some of the boys wore black caps, but otherwise they were almost naked. They lifted sticks in the air together whenever they came to an easy patch. They were chanting. Something to do with the bundle that the errant twins carried so carefully. Ralph picked out Jack easily, even at a distance, tall, red-haired, and inevitably leading the procession. Simon looked now from Ralph to Jack as he had looked from Ralph to the horizon and saw what seemed to make him afraid. Ralph said nothing more, but waited while the procession came nearer. The chant was audible, but at the distance still wordless. Behind Jack walked the twins, carrying a great stake on their shoulder. So if you imagine, like, those movies where they come out of the woods and people are tied to the stick held between the two islanders. The gutted carcass of a pig swung from the stake, swinging heavily as the twins toiled over the uneven ground. The pig's head hung down with a gaping neck and seemed to search for something on the ground. At last the words of the chant flooded up to them across the bowl of blackened wood and ashes. Kill the pig, cut her throat, spill her blood. So that's the chant. Kill the pig, cut her throat, spill her blood. Yet as the words became audible, the procession reached the steepest part of the mountain, and in a minute or two the chant had died away. Piggy stibbled, and Simon shushed him quickly, as though he had spoken too loudly in church. Now the groups of boys get into a fight, or a verbal argument that, remember, Ralph had tasked the hunters and Jack to keeping the signal fire alive. So this is page 70. The fire's only been out an hour or two. We can light it up again. He noticed Ralph's scarred nakedness and the somber silence of all four of them. He thought charitable in his happiness to include them in the thing which had happened. His mind was crowded with memories of the knowledge that had come to them when they closed in on the struggling pig, knowledge that they had outwitted a living thing, imposed their will on it, taken away its life in a long, satisfying drink. So interesting that Jack's tendencies tend towards the wild and the painted face and now the long hair versus the civility that is represented by the fire. And the end of the chapter is this very ritualistic dance. And finally, in the darkness, Ralph wanders away from the group into the darkness back to the beach to find the conch shell. So interesting. We have two separate now groups of children who perhaps are not happy with each other, and we'll see what happens as we progress.